they're also used for forage or orchard products, so nuts and fruits. In general, there's two paths to the establishment of silvopasture, and I call them silvopasture via subtraction or thinning or addition, and I'm going to look at that next. If I can get my slides to advance. Okay, so, oops, that's not it. What happened here? Okay. So we're going to take a look at some. Sorry, something happened with my slides. I'll just stick with this slide just for a second. This is an example of a site in eastern Washington in Spokane County. It's comprised of 1,000 acres, 1,200 acres, give or take. 800 of it is in ponderosa pine, and 200 acres of it is in pasture. This is a cow-calf operation. It's the fourth generation. They've been running cows on this property for hundreds of years. The herd size varies between 100 and 150 head, and they have 40 plus electrical temporary paddocks of various sizes. The livestock are moved every 24 to 72 hours, depending on forage quantity, the precipitation. And in this site, the trees were, again, all ponderosa pine, and the trees were arranged between 120 to 150 trees per acre, or stems per acre. And the landowners were in the process of reducing that down to around 100 trees per acre. So there was a thinning that was occurring, and those trees were being thinned, and then the entire trees being removed from the landscape and then sold for firewood or pulp. And I apologize, I'm going to skip a slide here because that one's out of order. Well, I guess I can use that one. So this is another one, Eastern Washington. I apologize for the graininess. This is the same site. So this is a 240 acre ranch in Pend Oreille County. 160 of those acres are in pasture, and then 80 acres are in timber. Again, ponderosa pine is the dominant species here. They have approximately 100 paddocks of various sizes between 2 and 0.5 acres. The livestock includes 75 Berkshire pigs, roughly 50 to 100 Angus Red Devon cross, which is a cow-calf operation, plus a few stud, I guess. And they also had some sheep grazed on site for a little while, about 25 sheep. And this site had a younger age class of ponderosa pine, because you can see that the pigs are, well, they're big pigs. They're relatively large. The pines are relatively small compared to the pigs. So there were roughly around 250 trees per acre, so more trees per acre than the last site. And then this site was thinned down to 120 trees per acre, and then they pruned. And we'll get into pruning a little bit later, but by pruning, they're taking the lower limbs off, which allows for greater sunlight infiltration down to the forest floor. Okay, this is the one I thought I was going to do next. So we're going to jump to the west side of the state. Here we've got a 20-acre farm in San Juan County. Excuse me. 12 acres of it are in orchard, and the orchard is consisted of Asian pear, kiwi, and filberts. And then 9 acres of the site are in timber, and that's a host of trees with predominantly Douglas fir, mixed within a little bit of red cedar, Gary oak, some madrone, lodgepole pine, hooker's willow, black hawthorn, and English hawthorn as well. The herd size is of approximately 20 to 25 ewes, and the landowner has 26 temporary paddocks, again using electric fencing, and we're going to look at that in just a little bit. And the paddocks tend to be about 0.5 acres. Now this site also, they've improved the forages, so we have several types of clover, chicory, orchard grass, and plantain that was integrated into the site and by direct seeding. All right, we've got one more site here. This is a 5-acre farm in Skagit County, and I found out some information that I didn't know about the site previously, just yesterday. This is a 3-acre irrigated silvopasture, meaning that they actually not just irrigate the trees, but they irrigate the entire pasture. And if you guys can see my cursor, there's a sprinkler system irrigation. So not just the trees are irrigated, but the entire pasture is. New information. The silvopasture is comprised of chestnut and hazelnuts, and then there's an additional 2 acres of pasture that are being converted into silvopasture. Sheep are Suffolk cross, so they're grown for their meat, not for their wool. There's approximately 7 to 10 ewes on site, and then they have about 14 to 20 lambs birthed every year. And the lambs, once they reach a certain site, they are exported off-site. Approximately 7.5 feet per between the spacing of the trees, and then approximately 20 feet between the rows of the trees, and each row is approximately 300 to 320 feet long. So cool site there. And then I have a video here. It's going to be grainy, and for some reason the video isn't going to come through, so I'm just going to narrate with this. So this is the silvopasture site in Skagit County. So here's our chestnuts right here that are 10 plus years of age. And the sheep are hanging out underneath there rather than their preferred shade structures. Well, we'll see in a little bit. They're using some electric fencing right here between the tree rows. And the ewes right here, this is before they've given birth, tend to graze this alleyway of 300 feet for about 24 hours. And here on the other end of their shade structures, which they will use if it's cold or windy out. And those shade structures are very movable. Cool site. So this is a row that they just finished grazing, and you can see there's a lot of forage still left on the landscape, which is what we want. We want a good percent coverage. We want vegetation that can resprout. We don't want to see any bare mineral soil there. And you can see in the row to the right, which we're just about to go to, there's a lot of flowering clover there. And then when the landowner does move the sheep, they'll move that electric fencing and allow them to graze one row at a time. Kind of cool. All right. Oh, next one. All right. So next, let's look at what is not classified as silvopasture. So this is an example in Washington, an undisclosed site where the animals are enclosed and their movement is not regulated. So they're just hanging around in a given area. They're not moved at any specific time, if at all. And we can see a depreciable loss of understory vegetation where we see bare soil and very little vegetation. We see concentrated nutrient deposition, aka poop. And this can lead to a lot of issues. It can lead to nutrient runoff, soil compaction, and also allows for the increased potential for an invasive and or exotic species. So not silvopasture. Here's another example or two of a non-silvopasture site where we have limited overstory management, or we have trees that are just really thick, and thus that decreases forage growth and also decreases the carrying capacity of the livestock. There's limited or no regulation of livestock movements, which increases soil erosion and decreases tree viability, as noted in this right-hand picture where we are actually starting to see tree roots. Finally, this is also a non-silvopasture site. This is in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Washington State, where there is absolutely no management of the understory or overstory vegetation, and there's no regulation of the livestock. These livestock are allowed to graze between late April all the way through the end of November, and they can go wherever they want. And there's lots of literature that has noted that this type of forest and grazing management leads to increased high severity fires and increased establishment of both invasive and exotic species. And just for fun, I'm going to let you guys take you just a few seconds and see how many cows you can see in this picture. And so for fun, there's one there, there's a second one, and the third one you probably didn't see is a black cow kind of hiding in the shade right there. So they're 10 feet away. All right. So those are some examples of silvopasture versus non-silvopasture. So now we're going to look at how the establishment of silvopasture occurs in this region. And typically there's two trajectories that I've seen. There's pasture to silvopasture, and this pasture to silvopasture might include cropland or just pastured areas. And then there's a forest to silvopasture. This is an established forest stand that is thinned to a silvopasture system. Oh, I guess I'm supposed to tell you that this site was not taken in Washington. It's actually in Western Idaho. Don't tell anybody. All right. So steps for establishing pasture to silvopasture. Gathering your team. I think this is super important. One of the things that I've noted in Washington and other parts of the United States is it takes a team of specialists, whether that's an orchard specialist, a forage specialist, a forester that comes up with a forest management plan. You might need a soil specialist as well. And the challenge of silvopasture is because it is such an interdisciplinary management system, and it does require somebody with a broad range of knowledge and or a team of specialists. Conducting a site assessment is very key. Site assessment really depends on the site, but some aspects that I would suggest is determining site productivity, looking at resource concerns such as erosion, potential for fire, water, access, also appropriate size and location to justify grazing. And also another one that I call fence ability is, can this site be fenced easily with either permanent cross fencing or electric fencing? Next up is selecting trees that are appropriate to the site conditions. I know in Eastern Washington, there's a real big push to include honey locusts because it's a great fodder tree for livestock. It's a really adaptable tree, but there's not a lot of information that I'm aware of as whether this tree is appropriate for Eastern Washington or Western Washington. So we want to select trees that are good for the site, but also good for the intent purpose of the tree. So whether that's shade, timber, non-timber, fodder, fruits or nuts, those are all considerations that we should take into consideration before planting the trees. Next up, determining the configuration, north-south orientation if you're planting in rows, on contour, and then determining stand density of the trees. Stand density is not just only a consideration of the tree, but it's also how you're going to manage the trees in the future, which comes up to the next one point is just short or long-term management plan. This might include livestock exclusion, how you're going to manage protection of the tree, if you're going to be doing weeding around the tree, if you're going to be irrigating, how you're going to be protecting from voles and wildlife. This site right here also had a lot of elk. So the landowner had to, you can't see in this picture, but there's a elk-proof fence just around these trees until they were established about 10 years of age. Apparently elk will eat anything. And finally, determining forage improvements. You would need a Marty Cheney or another human being on the state that understands which forages are appropriate for the sites in your livestock. And then speaking of livestock, I would also suggest you need to determine what your stocking density or animals per unit month, or your carrying capacity of your livestock, and what is appropriate for that site given your forage, precipitation, and the number of trees per acre. Yes, I know Washington does have trees, but this is a great silvopasture site. All right, so another element that I want to talk about in terms of protecting trees is the technology around that. And I'm going to give you a few more examples, but I wanted to go back to this site in San Juan County where the landowner is using several types of tree protection. The first is these tree tubes, which you can see these plastic tubes around the tree of various heights. And these are great, and they have some pros and cons. They're really great for if you have a lot of vegetation around the tree. It's great fall habitat, especially if you're using wood chips or straw or hay as a weed suppressant. However, these are really great for protecting your trees from your livestock. The other thing that's happening in here is there is a hot wire that's adjacent to the irrigation line, and hopefully you can see my cursor right here, but there is a hot wire right there on both sides of the alleyway where the livestock can go underneath it, and they're allowed to graze multiple alleyways if needed, but it keeps the livestock away from the trees and keeps them from girdling them. Here is another example, same site, and I'm going to try to do my best to describe this. What the landowner's done with these Asian pears is they've created a V trellis. So as you're getting lower and closer to the trunk of the tree, the hot wires are very close. And then as you go up vertically, the hot wires on either side of the tree extend away from in a V formation. And what this does is not only protect the tree from the livestock, but it protects foliage and some of the fruit that might hang over. And while the sheep may gain access to some of that fruit as it droops down, certainly does protect the trees from getting grazed on by the livestock. This is an excellent example of tree protection. Here's some other examples from around the region, from around the US of tree protection. Number one right here, we have a tree tube surrounded by some temporary fencing secured by zip ties, and there's no electric portion to this. Number two, we have electric netting, which is really great for smaller animals, not necessarily cows or alpaca. Great for turkeys, sheep, and sometimes pigs. Number three, excuse me, is a tree tube with a single poly wire connected to the tree tube with a zip tie. And what this does is keeps the tree tube electrified, and it can be adjusted by height. And so these are folks out in New York, actually, and they liked this system for cows specifically, as it keeps the cows from going in there and trying to chomp those new leaves as they're emerging from the tree tube. Number four is a tree tube with a stake and with barbed wire around it. So this is another example of a non-electrified tree protection system. The issue with this is if a cow tail catches that barbed wire, they can pull the barbed wire right off, and they'll yank down the tree tube and the tree. So that has to be really well secured, and you need to watch out for your cow tails. And then number five, these are called living fence posts back east. And so what you have is a tree with some insulators and hot wires that are connecting the tree, the insulators to the hot wire. And you can see two hot wires at two different heights. So this is a great example. And there's a lot more examples out there as far as protecting trees. These are just a few excellent examples. All right, so now we're going to move on to forest and silvopasture. And I've seen a lot of this more in Eastern Washington than I have in Western Washington. So similarly, we're going to get a team together and we're going to look at all the same factors as we did for the afforestation. Again, you're going to conduct a site assessments. This might be based on thinning. This site specifically was thinned incrementally, partially due to time and labor constraints. So it was originally around 300 trees per acre. Then they got it down to 200 plus. And then I think they're around 150 trees per acre. And their goal is to get it down between 100 and 120. So that can happen incrementally. And as the tree density went down, they were able to increase their grazing density gradually as forage quantity increased. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen all together all at the same time. Ideally, that'd be great, but gradations are fine. Again, determining which species age class. And I'll talk about this in a second, but age class has a lot to do with how the silvopasture is operated. Again, same kind of considerations, whether you're going for shade, timber, fodder. Toxicity is an issue as well for cow-calf operations. All pines are toxic to cow fetuses. So if they get access to those green needles while the cow's pregnant, that can lead to an abortion. And thus, pruning is a very good and necessary component. Okay, modifying the stand density for adequate sunlight to reach the vegetation. So as far as when I was talking about age class, typically in silvopasture across the United States, we typically see an even age class. Now, this is true for most cases. However, it's not true for all cases. There could be two different age classes in there. depending if you have a shade-loving tree, such as Douglas fir, that tolerates a little more shade. However, if you do have two age classes, you're going to see changes in trajectory and the amount of forage in the landscape. That's why even age class is really great, because you can really modify the amount of light that is getting to the landscape. Consider forage improvements. Very important, though challenging. Again, for forage improvements in this kind of setting, landowners, one of the cool technologies that they come up with is when they do bale feeding. So in winter, they'll set out bales in these stands where the livestock will graze that down, and they'll graze it down to the mineral soil. And right before the snow melts, landowners will go in there and seed really heavily into those areas that have been bale grazed. Also, a really cool technology that I've seen is when they have thinned the stands and there's a lot of slash out there, they'll do a pile burn. And then after the pile has been burnt and they've had a seasonal winter with a lot of precipitation, they'll seed into that area where that's burned. So fun technology there. Also, you need to determine your carrying capacity of your livestock and determine the timing of your introduction. And then consider the property in terms of silvopasture and pasture. Anytime you have trees, and again, the landscape, you're going to reduce the amount of forage that's on the landscape because you have shade, competition for moisture from the trees and the forage. Thus, you're going to have less carrying capacity. So many of the landowners, as noted before, have a mixture of silvopasture and pasture. All right, the last thing I want to talk about as far as trees is canopy density. So this is an element where you're monitoring the amount of light that's coming through the canopy onto your forest floor. And there's a couple ways to do this. And there's, I guess before I talk about the ways to do it, the reason why you're going to do it is decreased canopy density, as noted here, increases the amount of sunlight. And this varies from tree species and forage species. And monitoring really is the key here. And before going forward, I have to say we don't really have the data. We don't have a lot of information about, what is the appropriate canopy density for ponderosa pine, Doug fir, Gary oak. That's going forward, and I'll try to discuss some methods of ways that the people on this call can collect that information. So this is one of the tools. It's really easy to use. This is a spherical densiometer. You have a concave mirror with a grid system on there. And the nice thing is you can, the directions come with spherical densiometer, and you're just adding up a percentage and then determining the percentage of your canopy density using transects, where you just repeat your steps every, however that long it is, like a 10, 20 feet, 100 feet transect, and you're monitoring that canopy density. And again, monitoring is key here because it's not static. That is going to change seasonally. It might include yearly, depending if you have deciduous or coniferous trees. As trees grow, those canopies will close in, and thus you need to be monitoring them. This is another type of densiometer. I've used this one before. Nice thing about it is you can walk and look at your densiometer. It has a little crosshair on the top. And this one's very effective for monitoring canopy density if you have established transects. And the nice thing about it too is it's really cheap. It's just literally a piece of PVC pipe with two mirrors on it. Super easy to use. It's cheaper than the spherical densiometer, and there's been peer-reviewed studies on this showing that it gives you the same amount of data. All right, I want to talk a little bit about forage management, and I know I'm going a little over time, but we're almost there. So proper forage management in silvopasture is essential for healthy and productive systems. Following any rigorous rotational grazing schedule, there should be monitoring of forage regrowth, percent cover, and height. Monitoring this kind of data will help support your trees, your livestock, and your soils. Ideally, your forages should be adapted to your site. So think soil, precipitation, shade, and your livestock. We need to think about digestibility, nutrient content, and caloric value. These are all considerations that we want to think about when establishing or managing for our forage. So this is, again, I guess I kind of already covered this. A productive site, you manage your forage management. You need to look at your grazing schedule and monitor your forage accordingly. And forages are managed for site and livestock. This is a great picture that was taken in 2020. Yes, 2020. This is the Silvopasture site that's in Spokane County, which on average gets about 20 inches a year. So one of the things that when I see this picture is I see a high percentage cover of forage. This is a 20-acre paddock that's raised by approximately 100 cows for 48 hours. When the cows are moved off, and depending on how much rain they get, how much forage rebounds, they might graze this paddock again, or they might not. They might stop grazing that paddock for the entire growing season until the next year. So there's a lot of time in between coverage or grazing events that needs to occur. Can't really tell the height of the forage in this picture, but it was around 4 to 6 inches after the grazing event. All right. Some other management activities include spot spraying. Be helpful to get rid of shrubs, depending on the type of livestock you have. Mowing around trees or weed whacking, especially if you're doing afforestation. Pruning is, again, necessary for forage, allows more for light to get it into the lower canopy, increase forage, and also removes any toxicity as far as pines for your cow-calf operation. Mastication is very key, and removing that dead biomass or necromass allows for more forage to grow. I know that DNR was working with several of the landowners that I was researching, and they were using mastication, and they would go in there and improve their forages. And then also excluding livestock. And I realize this is a challenge in some areas, especially when you have limited forage. All right, I'm going to zoom through these because I'm looking at the time. So economic reasons for benefits of silvopasture, you have multiple revenue streams. If you're not harvesting your trees, if you're harvesting your trees every 40 to 60 years, you have livestock, wool or meat income yearly. And that provides both short-term and long-term sources of income. And then economic risk is distributed. In 2021 in Eastern Washington, and I assume Western Washington as well, there was a massive drought. And forage dried up. It senesced very early. Hay prices were extremely high. And so a lot of the silvopasture practitioners, they had believe it or not, the forage in the silvopasture senesced later because there was less evapotranspiration underneath those trees, so their green grass stayed green longer. And they were also able to reduce their herd size. And then when their herd size was decreased the following year, they were allowed to, thin their trees, gain some income from there. So that was an excellent example of how drought affects silvopasture. Ecologically, there's lots of reasons. For heat and cold stress, for livestock, trees are really helpful. Nutrient distribution, again, that's regulated by rotational grazing. Increased soil health when compared to continuous grazing sites. I have a little star there. And increased biodiversity when compared to continuous grazing sites. And that data is actually forthcoming from a paper that I'm writing. Challenges. It's ecologically and economically complex for all the reasons we've discussed thus far. Without proper management, we can have long-term ecological and I would say economic challenges. One of the challenges of silvopasture is you have decreased carrying capacity. When you have trees on the landscape, there's less forage. And so that might not work economically for a small acreage. Unfortunately, in this area, we have few regional examples. We're hopefully working towards getting more data, collecting more data, and getting some more information out there to professionals and landowners. This has also been brought up in this group before, but this may have considerations for tax and land use. And so working with conservation districts, county tax assessors is going to be paramount. It requires a highly skilled manager. These are managers that have 10 plus years working with trees, livestock, and forage. It's not appropriate for all sites. I have an example right here. This is Beth Robinette of Lazy R Ranch. She's been managing, she and her dad have been managing her livestock on her ranch for several years. And these are some of the requirements that I've gained from Beth and her dad. You have to be comfortable with practicing rotational grazing. You have to have time and labor to move the animals often and efficiently. Having a team is very helpful. Beth and her dad work with some foresters. They work with grazing specialists from WSU. They monitor their soil health, specifically carbon and bulk density, and they're constantly managing their forages. And you have to have a willingness and ability to adjust your grazing practices, herd size, manage your forages and trees. And then you have to like working with and from others. And I would also say that you need to be skilled in monitoring ecological data. All right. And finally, one of the things that I've noted across the United States is where silvopasture is most effective, most well documented is when we have interagency communication, sharing of knowledge and best practices. And so there's a number of entities here in Washington State that would be paramount and helpful in establishing silvopasture and sharing knowledge both with each other and with landowners. So. And finally, here's some resources. Write these down. I'll have Patrick forward to these to you after my talk. All right. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's any thoughts or questions.
That was awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Yep.
We do have a couple questions in the chat, but people can also feel free to, unmute yourself and ask away. But to get started through one of the questions in the chat, Heidi asked, in a newly established tree planting, does it have to reach a certain age before it can be used as silvopasture?
That's a great question, Heidi. And the answer, as always, which is just not a fun answer, is it depends. You probably saw that answer coming. But I've seen in both Washington and other portions of the United States is tree planting age is not so much age as height of the tree, which I guess is age. And so you want the leaves and a majority of the forage, leaf matter away from the livestock. So they can't like go in there and chew on the tree, pull it over and bend it down. But with a lot of the technology that we have out there, tree age can vary. So it really depends on the technology you're using to protect your trees.
All right, got another one from Kevin. He says, have you seen any examples of coppiced or pollard fodder trees in silvopasture?
Coppiced, yep, absolutely.
Hmm.
Back east, they integrate. I mentioned honey locust and willow. They'll coppice those and let livestock graze on them. I haven't seen pollard, and this is a question that's been brought up to NAC before, I believe. I don't know if Kate's on here. She might actually have more information. Is Kate? She is not on here. That's okay. We have not seen pollard trees, but that's a question that's been going around. So that's a good question. But coppiced, yes. So that's a fun one to see.
I believe there was a book published recently on coppice agroforestry, and I won't even guess who the author was. I knew it at one point.
Carrie actually has the book, I believe. Oh, there it is.
Hey, nice.
Carrie, what's the title of that book, please? And the author?
Coppiced Agroforestry is the title, and the author is Mark Kraukowski. I'll type it in the chat since I'm not pronouncing it well.
Thanks. So you got another one here from Dana. She asked, what about tree damage caused by the livestock from rubbing or horns? Was there much of
Yeah.
that?
So I've seen that in Eastern Washington and other portions of the United States. Excuse me. So rubbing is an issue, and that's why we need tree protection, especially for young trees. The trees can be girdled even by rubbing. I saw a site in Eastern Washington where even a ponderosa pine of like 10 inches was girdled by the livestock, and they would just go in there and just itch themselves on there. And so part of that can be negated by using rotational grazing. So if the landowner is, again, intentionally and intensively managing their livestock, their trees, and their forages, you're aware of that happening, and so you move them off that paddock if that's occurring. Um, other technology that which is really great. If you ever go onto YouTube and you have some free time, there's some brushes that you can actually put on the landscape that cows are designed for cows. I think they're called cow scrubbers, but they're actually these really bristly brushes. And you put them on the landscape, and the cows can just rub up against them. And it actually decreases the prevalence of cows rubbing against trees, which is pretty cool.
Are there animals that are more inclined to girdling trees than others? And is that also related? I've heard like sheep are pretty can do that, but that it's actually tied to
Sheep,
parasites. And so that
goats, cows, they can all girdle. I'm sure pigs can girdle too. Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a prevalence necessarily. Um, it's just based on how the livestock are managed in the landscape. I've seen sheep. One of the sites that I previewed in my presentation, the sheep were really trying to get at those pears, and they would just girdle all around very delicately. But they would remove the bark and the cambium off of the vines and trees. So that's another reason to use technology such as hot wires or tree protectors or tree tubes. Yep.
Lindsay, feel free to unmute and ask a question.
Hey Mark,
Let's see.
how you doing?
Hi.
So in my experience on the west side, like with I think my question is going to be applying to like poison toxic plants to cattle and whatnot, and ragweeds are really, really toxic and cause abortive issues or birth defects and death. And so, but I've also noticed a lot of times cattle won't even touch them. And while ponderosa pine and lodgepole are really economically valuable on the east side, do the cattle really eat the needles, or do they leave it alone, or do you have to manage for that? Because that was kind of a question I had when working for extension. I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, this is a great question. When I was in New York, the Brett Chedsvoy, who works for Cornell Extension, took us out to his silvopasture sites. And in one of his silvopasture sites, he had not only toxic trees in the form of pines, but he also had a lot of toxic understory. He had digitalis and things like that. And one of the questions that we brought up was like, hey, there's all this toxic stuff in the landscape that could cause abortion or other medical issues in your livestock. What do you do about that? And again, his answer is it depends. But part of that was allowing the livestock access to enough high quality forage where that if there is something toxic in the landscape, they're going to go for the stuff that tastes good, like we all do. And they're going to eat that. And while they may eat some of those toxic things, the the stochasticity, the amount of toxic to non-toxic is it leans heavily towards that the nutritional dense good stuff that they like, and they'll just eat a small amount of that. And a lot of that is actually regulated through that rotational grazing. So they're not in there long enough to get rid of all the good stuff, and then they're just left with things they'd rather not eat. And then they start consuming that, and then that becomes a problem. And that's also true for trees and needles. Beth Robinette, who's I think you've been on her property or near it. She, every now and then there's one mama cow that will, eat those needles and then abort. And one of the things that they do is they manage the herd. So if they have a cow that regularly eats those needles, that cow is removed from the herd. So it's monitoring for behavior as well as, movement. So, yeah. Good question. It's good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, back on the east side, and so if you need help with anything, I'm
Cool.
here.
Let's see. I see Heidi's question. Does each paddock have its own watering facility and troughs and pipelines? It's a good question. In Eastern Washington, they use water troughs that are easy to bring around, and they'll use a water buffalo and just fill it up and monitor that. Usually has a float attached to it. K-pods are another thing used on the west side. So, movable troughs that are easy to move between rows. So yeah, I think there's lots of different ways. One in Okanagan County and what is that, north central Washington. I saw a landowner that had permanent cross fencing, and if you can picture yourself a plus sign, there was depending on which of the pastures they were in, they would have one of the gates open to the trough that was in the center of these the intersection of the 4 paddocks. And so he had that gate open so they could go to that permanent watering facility. And I'd probably have to draw you a picture of what that actually looks like, but he could open a pasture, and then they would go through a gate associated with that pasture to the permanent watering trough. So there's lots of different ways around that. Lots of good technology out there, and also very low cost technology. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? I will say again, one of the things we don't have is we don't have all the answers here. We need to identify more sites and best management practices. And I think we're on our way there with the team of people that we have on these calls, and sharing information, sharing what you're seeing out there, and then passing on those good practices to other areas and other people is really what we need.
Maybe on that note, what do you see as like the priority research focuses for silvopasture in this region? Like, what are the big
research? That's a really good question. We just so in the National Agroforestry Center, we're constantly looking at what is necessarily needed as far as technical assistance and or research. So from a research perspective, one of the things I am really excited about, and we're working on publishing a paper right now, is using silvopasture as a means to reducing fuel loads in the landscape, and thus making landscapes much more fire resilient. And while this may not necessarily apply to the western portion of Washington State, eventually it will, because that area will burn. So that's one thing that's really interesting. We need more research on, and Stephen Lee, if he's still on this call, he can speak to more of this than I can, and so can Marty, is we need a lot more research on appropriate forage species given, shade density and livestock. And there's landowners, the early adopters of silvopasture, they use what they have. They monitor it and they share that information when appropriate. But we need more trials to determine what are the best species for silvopasture. And then we also need to look at a lot more as, what the effect of silvopasture is on soil health, so bulk density. We need to look at things like electrical conductivity, the amount of salt, how silvopasture affects pH. We need to look at how silvopasture affects tree health. If we're seeing compaction around trees, if we're seeing diseases that are associated with silvopasture, this is another good research topic.
Also, Heidi had a follow-up question on paddocks. I guess it's not really a follow-up, but is it necessary for silvopasture to have associated open pasture for extra forage?
No, it's not necessary. Excuse me. There are a number of landowners in other regions of the United States that use 100% of their land as silvopasture. So there's no pasture set aside. However, those are areas and regions that receive a lot more precipitation. And so their forage is not as limited by precipitation as our region is. So I think the balance there is, knowing your carrying capacity of your livestock. From an economic perspective, if you're a small landowner and you want to use your 20 acres of Douglas fir on the west side, and you want to have your sheep, let's just say, out there, well, the amount of forage that you're going to have available to those livestock are going to limit the number of head that you can have on your system, on your silvopasture system. So you're decreasing the amount of economic streams that you have. Basically, you have less livestock per acre. That's why I see a lot of landowners having that blend of silvopasture and pasture, is because it allows them to have more livestock per acre. And it also gives them a little bit more flexibility on the rotational grazing. The livestock are going to be out in the pasture longer than they are going to be under the silvopasture system, because they're going to eat up that forages under those trees a lot faster than they are in the pasture system. But again, it really depends what's available. The site out in Skagit County that has the chestnut hazelnut that's irrigated, that's gonna, because it's irrigated, the water is not an issue for forage, so that forage is going to regrow very rapidly, and so they're converting that entire site to silvopasture. So it really depends on your resources, your precipitation, your forage, and your economic goals, I would say.
Also, follow up on that, Mark. Is there also, a balance to be considered with the tree crop that you have within your system and the economic return on that tree crop as well, right? Where you might have reduced production in your livestock, you might have extra production with a fruit crop or a nut crop or a timber crop.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it may not be just that we're only decreasing production, but we're balancing with something else too.
Yeah, and we have to think of that spatially across the landscape and temporally. Trying not to sound like a nerdy scientist here, but one of the things that we need to look at is, okay, so if my apple trees, for example, I have cider apple silvopasture, let's say, which I haven't seen yet, would be really fun to see. I know that as soon as I plant those trees, I might not get a return value for 5 to 10 years. Before I get the return value in the cider from the fruit. So in the meantime, I'm grazing my livestock because there's probably more sunlight getting to the floor because the canopy hasn't grown out. And then as that canopy closes, I'm going to be reducing the amount of livestock on the land. And then I'm probably going to be gaining more economic income from the apples in the form of a product like cider, or just selling the apples. So you're right, there is a balance that constantly needs to be looked at. I think a lot of people think of silvopasture in terms of establishment, but the next thing we really need to look at is the management aspect of it. So while establishment is key and we need more data on that, we also need data on the management side. We need economic data, and we need ecological data. Virginia Tech is going to be releasing an economic tool for silvopasture next year. Sorry, I forgot what year it is. That will allow you to look at your tree density, your tree species, the labor it costs to install that tree. Let's say it's ponderosa pine, just easy enough. How much it costs per tree, the labor that is associated with establishing that tree and maintaining it, the space that tree needs, and then what's your return value. If you're going to be harvesting that tree in 60 to 80 years, how much you could potentially get for that, depending on market value. So we need more economic tools to kind of track that data, and that would help landowners determine, how they're going to balance their systems, so that depending on what you're managing for. So that's a really great point, Carrie. Thank you. Plant breeding focusing on silvopasture would be great. Excellent points. If Stephen Lee is on here, I don't know, Stephen, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, thanks, Mark. Great talk. Great conversation. I can talk a little bit about what we're doing. I don't want to steal the show or anything, but we are looking at 11 different species that have been historically were released from the Pullman Plant Materials, the NRCS Pullman Plant Materials Center. And, not all of them, but several of them had been released for forage uses and various things like that. Also, within conservation of erosion and things like that. But we have a 6-acre ponderosa pine orchard that you're aware of, Mark. And I can't remember the density, but it's, probably 100, maybe a little bit less, 100 trees per acre. And so we're setting up plots actually this spring. We were going to set them up last spring, but something got a hold of us, and do replicated trials on their growth pattern. And then also, so comparing them to full sun, how late do they go in the year before they senesce? We already know by some pot studies, greenhouse studies under shade, that they do go longer and that they grow more tillers per plant in the shade. And so they'll seed later. And then we're going to take the biomass out of those and see if they are equal to what's growing in the full sun. And then also try to look at some forage values, protein, and some, we haven't really discussed all that, but like something like protein values in that as well. And then we're also examining kind of two things: single species and then mixes. We have some work that's being done with sandfoin, which was probably more appropriate for eastern and maybe central Washington than it would be for western. But the inclusion of mixes, legume species in those, with those grass mixes, really interested in those perennial legumes, and how do those stands persist over time. So if you have let's just say a 20 or 30% ratio, does that stand persist over time? And so those are long-term studies that we're moving into. To answer the question about plant breeding, we are selecting, we will be selecting and collecting germplasm and doing the same sort of test with those germplasm and selecting.
Great. Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah.
And if you all, maybe Stephen, if you could post your contact information, if you're willing to, in the chat, and then people can reach out to you if they'd like to learn more. Again, what Stephen's doing with NRCS is absolutely necessary for good establishment and maintenance of silvopasture in Washington State. And while his research really is focused on Eastern Washington, I think we can replicate that those studies on the west side. Yeah. And I see Joe Williams is on here as well. Joe, I don't know if you want to speak to anything else related.
No, great conversation, Mark, and a great presentation as well too. But yeah, just echoing the work that Steven's doing out of the Plant Materials Center. I think it's going to go a long way for moving things along, especially in regards to some of the plant releases that are already out there and being able to utilize those and into this aspect. So no, thanks, great job.
But I also want to recognize that the conservation districts are key for silvopasture and agroforestry adoption. I know Thurston County, Thurston County Conservation District and Snohomish County Conservation District have been super helpful for me as a researcher, along with other conservation districts, to help identify silvopasture practitioners and sharing knowledge about best management practices. So, again, I want to highlight that last slide that I posted is landowners, if you're on here, you are scientists in your own right. I haven't met a landowner that doesn't know their land very, very well. That prolonged observation is super key. And then having NRCS and conservation districts collaboratively sharing that knowledge is key. What's been seen in other portions of the United States, that's kind of the formula that we need. So while we have more answers right here, I think it's an interesting time to be exploring silvopasture and agroforestry systems in general. And if you're daunted by the enormity of all the questions that are out there, don't worry. There's a growing number of people in this region that have information and or can direct you to the correct person. And the other thing that I would recognize too is the people that have silvopasture in Washington State, those are early adopters. They've made a lot of mistakes that we really haven't documented necessarily. No doubt they have overgrazed. No doubt they have had to thin their trees more, or they've had damage by livestock, going up and girdling their trees. And so the systems they have in place aren't static, and they're not just a one time and it's good to go. And they've learned a lot. And I think there's a lot we can learn from these landowners as far as learning what they've done, the trials and tribulations that they've gone through, what has not been successful, and then moving forward to what they're doing right now, and then asking questions like, okay, what is it that you need? So there's a continuum of knowledge here that I think we can draw from.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate you presenting. And yeah, Carrie, we're at the hour. Do we want to switch to the next part?
Yeah, I know, if some of you have to drop off and continue on with your day, that's great. But if you can stick around and just have a little networking time, I think that just to have more conversation and we can talk more about silvopasture or other things. I know Patrick has a little slide. We've got a few things to mention to the group. But I'd love, if you're new, if this is your first time attending one of these work group meetings, if you could, if you're willing to kind of turn on your camera and maybe introduce yourself. And if you're not new, if you've been here before, if you just want to give like a little introduction in the chat, and that's just for interest of kind of time, kind of who you are, what your organization is, maybe how you use or how you're integrated with agroforestry in the chat. And then if some of our new folks want to introduce themselves, and then we can move into more discussion from there. So do we have any brand new folks?
I can
Great.
jump on here real quick, Carrie.
Fabulous.
So I'll see if my camera will work today. I can't see it, but hopefully it's working. I'm Darla Klauser. I'm the resource tech for the Stevens County Conservation District, and we do a lot with kind of farm planning in general, but we've definitely been kind of aiming more towards a lot more livestock support. We've been kind of getting into some different projects with silvopasture, etc. We have the Vetter Farm, if you haven't heard of it. It's a WSU owned farm down in the Deer Park Valley. that is being actively managed by us at the district alongside the WSU extension here in Stevens County. And we try to, essentially it's a community platform to help support, you know, community education for different projects like these. So we will be doing a lot more these next couple of years. If any of you at any point are ever interested in jumping in as presenters, we definitely always appreciate good round knowledge bases for, you know, all your different experiences. So feel free to reach out to me. That you can just Google Stevens County Conservation District and I'm on there, and you can get a hold of me through email.
Thank you. And then Sophie, I see you've got a hand raised.
Hi there. I loaned my camera out, so I don't have a camera at the moment. But I am from the Jefferson County Noxious Weed Control Board. And I forget how I learned about this group, but maybe our conservation district recommended it. But forestry just feels like something our program really hasn't worked on much at all. And so just trying to learn a bit more about how it's integrated and how our community members could benefit from agroforestry and my role in helping control invasive and noxious weeds within that scope. So yeah, if I'm able to attend, I hope to be able to join a bit more. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for joining us. And it looks like Organic Farm School. I don't think we've had you attend before.
Hey, what's up? I'm Kevin Holton. I'm one of the field assistant from the Organic Farm School. I'm just here to learn more about agroforestry. So yeah, thanks for having us.
Kevin, I think I've been out to your site. Is that correct?
Yeah, that
a
is.
while
We came
ago,
out to Commando Island. Yeah.
right? Yeah. We'll have to talk more about where you're going with some agroforestry on your site.
Oh yeah,
at some point. Yeah. Great. Well,
Could you
welcome.
also-
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Could you tell us a little about I don't know anything about the Organic Farm School. I'm just curious to learn. Like,
Oh yeah, so we're located on Woodby Island, and we're just it's a nonprofit organization, and it's focused on training farmers, kind of like for market gardening style, but we also incorporate a lot of livestock, and we also do stuff for growing seed for contracts. So it's just it's kind of like I think it's like an 8.5 month program. And the farm itself is 10 acres, but we have about 4 acres under production. So it's pretty small scale, minimal tillage, a lot of cover cropping. Yeah, last year we had sheep and chickens. This year I think we're going to have sheep, pigs, and chickens. There's not really any agroforestry going on. It's mostly just annual vegetable. But yeah, I have a lot of interest in agroforestry and silvopasture, so that's kind of why I hopped on this meeting. So
awesome. Thanks.
yeah.
Great. Any other, Ryan? I see a hand. Oh, you're muted.
I always do that. I think by now everybody would know how to unmute, right? Yeah, so my name is Ryan Swick. I think I've joined one of these meetings before, so it's my second one here.
Oh,
I know Patrick, Carrie, talked to you both on the phone, so great to see you here. I completed this past year of the practicum program with Viva Farms in King County, basically small scale organic vegetable farming. And I was kind of thinking about like what are my next steps here that I want to take, and so agroforestry is definitely an area I'm looking to explore and just like learn a lot more about. I think like my longer term dream might be starting more of a perennial based farm, nuts, fruits, etc. And it's kind of was curious about that intermediate gap of like from the launch point to when you actually can maybe get yield and production from the nuts and fruit trees. What kind of strategies could you implement to help with revenue during that period? So Silvopasture seemed like an awesome way to kind of fill that gap, as Mark was mentioning. So definitely awesome to hear the presentation today, and great to meet all of you. So thank you.
Thanks.
All right. If you haven't gotten an opportunity and you're new and you want to introduce yourself, go ahead and raise your hand. And then if not, we can, Patrick, do you want to share that slide you created?
Yeah, just got a few updates, figured easier to look at them than. And you can also see Agroforestry New Northwest brand new logo.
This is our new logo, everyone. So
Hot off the press.
this is, yeah, the first time anyone's seeing it, I think. Yay, our pretty new logo.
Yeah, so I thought we just did the first part there, but I just was gonna try to structure this roundtable portion a little more in terms of updates and kind of divide it up by like grants, events, and upcoming opportunities and stuff like that. But if people have additional stuff to add to this, that would be great. Or questions, we can talk on this for a while, and then if there's time, which we're kind of getting towards the end, so maybe there won't be, I have a discussion question on the next slide to just kind of jog our brains a little. But so there's a couple open grants right now for agroforestry. One is the Infrastructure Reduction Act, this forest landowner support program. I have links for all of these that I'll drop into the chat. So that's more for like state agencies and universities that are eligible for that. Nonprofits are eligible for that as well. It's kind of a bigger federal grant. But it's something to consider, and they're accepting applications on a rolling basis right now. It would be really good for a forest farming proposal, and we're actually kind of in the works on something on that. But this one here is producer-led. This is a TILF Alliance program, the Washington State Organic and Sustainable Farming Fund. So the RFP doesn't call out agroforestry specifically, but it definitely sounds a lot like agroforestry in the language. So if you know landowners, or if you are a landowner that has a project that you want to get funded, this is a really good program for like implementation, like getting stuff into the ground. And I don't know, Carrie, have you ever applied to one of these?
I have helped landowners apply to this before. So yeah, I think this is a great opportunity for getting some funding to put in some agroforestry type of system on your land. If you're a private, if you've got a farm that you're wanting to get some practices started on. Agroforestry absolutely fits the bill of what this funding is for. And I think there's a lot of folks on this call that you could reach out to as well, myself included, maybe Patrick, and some others that could assist you with doing an application or helping you with some language or things like that. I think that the application is pretty straightforward, not anything too complex, but there's always folks out there that can assist you if you're interested in applications like this. And two, just when you're on a call, when we're together like this, noting who's on this call, noting some of the work folks are doing. And when we talk about grant opportunities, these are all potential partners here that we are looking at and talking with today and in future meetings, right? So thinking about too, what's our network, and how can that be utilized towards some of this grant funding? So if you've got a certain practice you're super interested in, or some kind of research question that you're really interested in, just taking note of kind of who the network is here and how that might fit in on some of these grant funds. So that's what I've got on grants.
No, this is definitely like part of the purpose of this space is to build those partnerships. So I encourage you to reach out to each other and us. And then there's a few upcoming events I think might interest people. The University of Missouri Agroforestry Symposium, they do this every year. In January, it's the 17th this year. It's virtual, and there's a lot of really good information. It's not region specific, or it's not specific to our region, I should say, but they are focusing on silvopasture. So, there's some additional information to glean and complement what we learned from Mark today. So I really enjoy that program a lot. There's a lot of good practical information. If you're excited and willing to go to Costa Rica, the National Agroforestry Conference from the Association of Temperate Agroforestry, They're hosting their biennial conference in Costa Rica this year. I can't go as much as I want to, but some of the sites that they're going to visit there, I'm really jealous. So if you have a wild hair and want to go to Costa Rica and Peru, I strongly recommend this. And I put all the links in the chat, by the way, for registration for some of this stuff.
And if any of you go, then come back to one of these meetings and share your experience with everyone.
That'd be a great as a presentation. I'd love that.
It would, yeah.
If you live in Thurston County, we're going to be doing some agroforestry plantings in February. We don't have the details yet, but they're going to be kind of volunteers. It's going to be like a workshop / volunteer opportunity. So we're going to put some trees in the ground and learn about agroforestry. So if you're in this area or outside the area, it's going to be in Yelm. We just don't have the dates picked yet. So I can keep people posted on that as well. And then our next work group, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to mimic the, if you've ever been to the Savannah Institute's annual conference to do these nutshells where everyone shares 5 minutes, like what your interest in agroforestry is, or if you have a project, an agroforestry project, an agroforestry system, an agroforestry idea, whatever, talk about it for 3 to 5 minutes. And we're hoping this would be a way for us to get a little more in touch with what everyone else is doing, because we just have so much talent in these work groups. So that's the idea, and I'll send some emails about that to prepare folks, and but something to think about for February. And then Carrie, I included this, you mentioned it, but the San Juan Island Ag Summit is in March, and I think we're going to be presenting, right? Some agroforestry stuff there.
We are, yes. We are going to be doing a presentation. So yeah.
So wait out. And no, I don't think registration's open for that yet. But and then last, there's this job opportunity, in case anyone is interested. I just thought I'd share. The Tilth Alliance is hiring a farm program manager, and it certainly would be great to have someone in that position that is pro agroforestry. And I have that link in there as well. So yeah, that's all I have for updates. If there's any questions on that, I could try to field them, but really the information is mostly in the links. And I thought there was also a space too, if anyone has a new agroforestry project that they're excited about, not necessarily new to this group, but you've got a new project that you want to share, we could have some space for that. There's only about 10 minutes left. So Carrie, I don't know how you feel about getting into the discussion question, but
I think maybe we can throw the discussion question up there and just kind of open it up for if anyone else has some additional announcements or knows of anything that they want to throw on the board here.
Yeah.
If anyone has a project that they want to talk about or introduce or ask a question about. And then, if we want to throw up the question, and we may not be able to get into a big, deep discussion, but
I'll throw it out there. This is, this was an attempt for us to just, again, like really utilize all the talent that we have in this work group and gather people's experiences and use it towards sort of collect some data, frankly, on these big questions about how we can improve agroforestry adoption. So I'll just kind of leave that there to sit for a second. And again, too, as Carrie said, if you don't want to talk about this, but you have like a new agroforestry project or a different question, you can feel free to chime in, and unmute or type away in the chat. Both are welcome. And it looks like Marty asked, the recording will be available hopefully by the end of the week, although some of you might have caught that I turned it on until about 5 minutes into Mark's presentation, but that will be available soon, Marty, and I'll send that out in like a few days, hopefully, at the most. Nick, it sounds like you've got something. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, I didn't know if Margaret already shared it with the group, but we had another Silvopasture project funded through the commission that we're working through, doing drone flights throughout to kind of monitor and watch landowner has indicated that they're willing to share, but they just kind of want to wait until they see the final results before they kind of put the pen to paper on the consent to disclose. So that's pretty exciting. You know, just like Mark brought up, working as a team between foresters and farm planners, and it's great. I love the team ups. And then sorry, busy day. And then we just wrapped up a pretty big project with Squaxin Island tribe doing a native foods agroforestry planting for the harvestables in the understory. So that was a fun project that we partnered with their Salish Roots farm on, and did about a half-acre of planting of salal and huckleberry, and whole long list. And so I'm making use of that indigenous knowledge was a fun learning opportunity that we could just bring resources to the table on.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have a lot of questions about both of those actually, but I don't know if you can. Well, the Silvopasture landowner, I'll table that since it sounds like there's information you can
if it was most people, but about 10 years ago there was a bit of a hiccup, so we're going extra cautious, but they're a great cooperator. And I think I've spoken to you about them in the past because they've been doing maple syrup for about 15 years now.
Oh, it's the same folks. Yeah, I really want to meet them sometime.
Yeah, I mean, above and beyond, and Margaret went out and did her surveys, and he went out and bought a wood miser mill to make use of everything he was thinning. And so super exciting. And they did a cost share project in the past for a composting manure storage structure, and he plumbed it all up and put in PEX pipe in the concrete to draw heat off of, and he collects the leachate to irrigate. So he's mostly interested on returning the land back to how his grandfather managed it once upon a time. Big Norwegian influence, and wants to see it return to that state. Currently it's been used for overwintering, and but it's also the drought. So it was really interesting to hear that part of the talk today, to know that it is something that can alleviate some of those concerns with producers.
Yeah.
So exciting.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, maybe more to come, lessons learned and some of that. As we move forward. Marty, looks like Marty has her hand up.
Yeah, I just had a real quick question. I was wondering, Nick, what kind of survival you're getting on Salal? When we tried some plantings with it about 20 years ago, we were getting really low survival. So have they kind of overcome those challenges?
So it's been about, I want to say 3 months, maybe, since we wrapped up the project. Our first plants went in over summer. Part of the arrangement we made was that they would, water, irrigate, and tend to the plants. I think we did over 2,500 plants, and we've got over 90% survival when we inventoried a couple weeks ago. But again, it's also their community farm garden space too, so that there was active management of the plantings too, since they're meant to be utilized in kind of a harvestable state. So yeah, it did well. We put plant protectors on it, gave it the whole 9 yards. And
yeah, it'll be interesting to see how many last the first year. Hey, that's your
right. Yeah. We planted a bunch of Labrador tea. which was new to me. And so that's I was told those are extremely delicate as well. So I'm interested to see that. I don't know if anybody has worked with that or thoughts on that, but it was one of the top requested
I didn't even know
plants
that
by the
we
tribe.
had this area.
Well, we've got a topic for about a year from now when Nick can give a presentation on survival rates.
Yeah. Oh, gee.
Yeah,
Start collecting
exactly.
lead
We'll be reaching out to Nick for a presentation here.
site visits.
I do want to address, so Susan posted in the chat that one of the biggest hurdles that she's encountered with new farmers that are interested in agroforestry is having a pool of other agroforestry folks, practitioners, that they can relate to and learn from, like informal mentorships or farmer to farmer, that kind of thing, which is a big topic in and of itself and might be a great topic to bring up in our February meeting. But I will say, one of the things is, yes, a lot of folks at this stage are early adopters. So yeah, it might take initially some broadening of the network, right? Some casting of a wider net to find folks out there that are doing some of these things. I think we're learning of more and more folks all the time that are doing some great agroforestry practices. It's just finding them, learning who they are. Yeah, that's a whole conversation I think we could have.
Carrie, can I speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
I just want to acknowledge one of the projects that Carrie Abel Kloster is also on this call, and Patrick, they're working on a agroforestry handbook for the Pacific Northwest, which will be forthcoming in the next year or two. And one of the outcomes of that project will be to create these webinars on various agroforestry practices in both Oregon and Washington. And so that will be a great tool to keep an eye out for in the future. And that product will be freely available to the public, as I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong. They don't have to give their firstborn child, right?
No.
Okay, good. We try not to do human sacrifices in agroforestry, but I think that's a tool. But the other thing, again, I would bring to more of a national level is anytime that there's an interaction, I think there's a number of people here with land or experience in establishing their own silvopasture or they're professionals. And anytime we can weave a new network right there, I think that's super helpful. So, don't be shy. If you're the organic farm school and, you say that you just grow, CSA, but you might have land for like establishment of a windbreak or a hedgerow or something like that. There's an opportunity. Dana's on here and she's, potentially, going to establish some type of agroforestry or agricultural system there. So I think there's an opportunity there for this group to be a feeder for that. And that's going to promote agroforestry adoption wherever it's viable. But the other thing too is, while there is limited funding, it really depends what happens with the federal government in the near future. But I think people should keep an eye out on some of those resources. And again, there's a Abel and Carrie and Patrick and others on here really good at writing grants and have a lot of success in writing grants. And so, if you have the interest or you have the property, but you don't have money, reach out to some of these folks to, look at grants. Yeah, I think that's a resource that we shouldn't overlook. And also, not to tout NRCS, but NRCS is they have EQIP funding when appropriate for silvopasture systems and other agroforestry practices as they meet resource concerns. And so they can also be of great use for you when it comes to cost sharing programs. And then there's also conservation districts have cost sharing programs, and then the Washington State Conservation Commission. Did I get that right, Carrie? has cost sharing programs, and that's also I would encourage you to reach out to Carrie regarding those or other conservation districts. I think there's just a lot of opportunity here. We're just at a really ripe place for agroforestry.
Yeah. So we're at time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was great conversation. Mark, your presentation was fabulous. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I hope everyone enjoys their holidays, has a good new year, and we will be reconvening in the new year and maybe sending out some info in January and then having our first meeting of 2024 in February. So there will be more to come on that. And always feel free to reach out to us with questions, ideas, things, feedback on these sort of work group sessions and all of that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Great presentation.
Bye, everyone.
Good to see you, Lindsay.